Hey guys, I'm Dave with the Trull Gallery, and today we're going to build some floating shelves with a kind of a unique twist. My clients are finishing up remodeling their kitchen, and they wanted to add a couple of floating shelves. There were a couple of catches, though. They didn't want me to drill into the new tile on the walls, and the cabinet on one side has a lip that sticks out about a quarter of an inch that would prevent the shelves sliding in from the front. After a couple of trips to the drawing board and a little head scratching, I came up with a plan. Let's see how that came out.
This project started with two 8-quarter ash boards, and I cut them to just over their final length with the miter saw. I started with such large stock because my original plan was to keep the shelves solid, but I realized they'd be pretty heavy, so I went to plan B. Since I don't have a bandsaw yet, I resawed the stock at my table saw. I set the fence for a 5/8 of an inch cut, then raised the blade to about an inch. I pass on either edge and I raise the blade again. After 4 passes like this per side, the first panels were free. Now before I had cut them, I had marked one side on each board, one with a single arrow and the other with a double arrow, so I could keep track of which pieces went together, but this will all make more sense later. The thicker pieces of ash went over to the planer and I cleaned up the saw marks. Then it was back to the table saw where I repeated the resawing process. This gave me 3 pieces of stock from each of the 2 initial boards. Now I could line up the arrows that I had marked earlier to match up the boards and their correct sides together. I can now choose which grain pattern looked best to bookmark the faces of the shelves. Once I had chosen the best matches, I once again used new arrows to show me the layout for the glue-up. It was at this point that I realized I had only milled enough stock for 1 shelf, and I needed 2. So I got to do all those steps all over again. So much for prior planning. With all my stock milled, it was time for the glue-up. Using the arrows I had drawn on the faces, I set up 2 shelf faces in my clamps, glued the edges of each panel and adjusted the clamps. I added C-clamps at the joints to keep the faces in line before tightening the pipe clamps. Once the glue was dry, I pulled the stock out of the clamps and got ready to clean up the panels. A few passes through the planer and we were good to go. I made sure that I ran not just the shelf faces, but the shelf fronts, the spacers, and a few extra pieces just in case. Everything was milled down to 1/2 inch thick to give me the 1.5 inch final thickness I had planned for. Here you can really see the book match grain. I was able to get 3 really nice faces and one that was just okay. I figured that one ordinary face would be the top of the top shelf and no one would ever see it once it was in place. Next up, I ripped the front face of the shelves to 1.5 inches wide at the table saw. Another part of the build that didn't go to plan was the joinery. I had hoped to use my lock miter bit and router table to hold the shelves together, but the bit seems to have disappeared. I didn't think a simple miter joint would be strong enough, although a video I watched a few days later by Brad over at Fix This Build That proved me wrong. Regardless, I chose to go with a rabbet joint to fasten the faces to the front. I set my table saw up for the first cut of the rabbet. The blade was set to 1/2 inch high, and I set the fence 1/4 of an inch over from the blade. Then I cut both the top and bottom of the face pieces. The fence and blade were reset, and I ran the face cut to the rabbet. Cutting them this way allows the waste to fall clear of the blade and not get pinched between the blade and the fence. Then, using the stock I'd already milled, I checked to make sure the rabbet was deep enough. With that done, I could get a good measurement for the width of my shelves and cut the faces down. In hindsight, I might have cut a little off each side to keep the glue lines centered, but I didn't catch that in time. They still look great, but the book match just wasn't centered. I made a point to glue up an extra panel to be used as the interior spacers. I took that panel over to the miter saw and cut off enough stock so that each panel would have 4 spacers about 1.5 inches wide. Their width isn't critical, but their thickness is. They have to fit snugly between the upper and lower faces to keep everything in line once the shelves are assembled. While I was still at the miter saw, I set a stop for the width of my shelves and cross-cut the faces and fronts so they would all be the same length. In my case, this was also a critical measurement since these shelves had to fit between 2 existing cabinets. The bottom face of each shelf needed a cutout to accept the cleat that would be used to mount the shelf. To ensure a nice clean cut, I set the table saw fence to the correct width, added a stop block so I wouldn't go too far with my cut, and then raised the blade to its maximum height so the curve of the blade curve would be minimized. Then I finished the cutouts with a handsaw, staying as close to my line as I could. In what is probably my most unorthodox glue-up ever, I used levels to keep the bottom panels and filler strips from bowing or twisting during the glue-ups. The 2 outer strips were glued in place next to the cutouts I made on the bottom, just overhanging a bit so I could trim them flush later. The inner filler strips were spaced evenly in between. I also made sure that each filler was spaced just behind the line where the shelf face would sit. Lots of clamps and a bit of glue, and they were set aside to dry. I added another small piece by the outer filler strips to help strengthen the front of the shelves. When that was dry, both the strip and the small filler were trimmed flush with my palm router. A little cleanup with a chisel, and the rounded corners left by the router were squared off. With that done, it was time to add the face to the bottom. A bead of glue in the rabbet, and I clamped it up. I added a few blocks on top to help clamp things down, but I added packing tape to them first so they wouldn't stick to any glue squeeze out. A few bar clamps pulled everything nice and tight. When that assembly had dried, it was time to add the shelf top. Glue along the face rabbet and across each filler strip, and lots of clamps to hold things in place. Once that glue was dry, the front faces sat a bit proud of the top and bottom. I clamped them together with a 3/4 inch spacer to give my router a wide surface to run on, and then I trimmed the first 2 edges smooth. I flipped the stock around, got rid of the spacer, and clamped them back together. Then I could trim up the other 2 edges. With the shelves pretty much done, I could focus on the cleats. Since these will be seen, I had to use the same ash and milled them to fit neatly in the pockets on the shelves. With the machining and glue-ups done, I gave the shelves a good sanding, starting with my random orbit sander and 120 grit paper. I worked my way up through the grits until I stopped at 300. Now, normally I stop at 220, but I have a plan. I'm also not a big fan of hand sanding, but it's the best way to prepare the stock for the finish I'm going to use. I sanded everything with 400 grit paper and then switched over to 600 grit. At this point, you're not really sanding, more like burnishing. Here you can see how the raw wood is reflecting light, just from sanding to 600 grit. With the shelves prepared, it's time for my favorite finish, Danish oil. It's easy to apply. You just wipe it on and let it soak in, then wipe off the excess. I let the oil soak in for at least 20 minutes, but usually longer before I wipe it off. 1 coat a day for 6 days, and you get an amazing finish that just begs to be touched. You can't rush this process. Some purists say to wait weeks between coats, but even I'm not that patient. Another nice thing about this finish is it's easy to repair if you have to. Just sand the area, add more oil, and you're done. Here you can see why those floating shelves are a little different. My clients didn't want me to drill into the new wall tile, and because of the lip on the right-hand cabinet, sliding in from the front wouldn't work either. That's why I went with cleats drilled and screwed to the cabinet sides. Once the cleats were fastened to the cabinets, I could just drop the shelves in place, and this job was complete.
Once I got around the few obstacles this project had, things went pretty smoothly. The shelves dropped right into place, and the book-matched ash and the Danish Oil finish looked great, and they're so smooth to the touch. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this process. Was there something I could have done differently, easier, smarter? Put them in the comments below. I'd love to hear. If you enjoyed this video, maybe share it with friends and give us a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, maybe hit that subscribe button and the little bell so you get notified each time I put out a new video. Not sure what's coming up next, but it'll probably be interesting and a little weird. So for now, stay safe. Have a great day. We'll see you soon.